At 3:40 a.m. on 22nd June 2025, Lancashire Police received an emergency call from the Peridot Close residential area in Blackburn. The caller reported that a man was lying outside a house and was unresponsive. Just minutes later, Peridot Close, a quiet street in Blackburn, was awakened by the sound of emergency sirens as police officers and an ambulance arrived at the scene. The man was confirmed dead at the scene. The location where he was found was directly in front of the entrance to the victim's own home. In the very first moments, the scene revealed several important details. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The door was not broken, and there was no evidence of disturbed belongings. There were no indications that this was a burglary or an unlawful intrusion during the night. These factors allowed the police to quickly rule out the possibility of a domestic accident or a random act. The fact that the victim was found directly outside his front door suggested that he had encountered trouble while interacting with someone else, rather than while being alone inside his private space. The Peridot Close area was cordoned off to facilitate the investigation. Initial procedural steps were carried out to preserve the scene and gather information. Based on what was observed at the scene, the police reached an initial conclusion. This was a murder case. At this time, no information about a suspect was released, and the official investigation began from this point. After the scene was secured, the investigation moved into the next phase, a stage always considered the foundation of any criminal case. Identifying who the victim was and what his life was like. Police quickly identified the deceased man as Paul Scott, 37 years old, who lived at the very house on Peridot Close. Paul lived and worked in the Blackburn area and led a relatively quiet life. According to those who knew him, he was not someone who attracted attention and was not frequently involved in trouble or serious criminal activity. It was precisely this ordinariness that led investigators to raise an important question. Why did Paul Scott become the victim of a murder right outside his own home? From here, police began reconstructing the final hours of Paul's life. Who was the last person to see him? Who knew where he was in the early hours of that morning? And more importantly, within Paul's circle of relationships, were there any unresolved personal conflicts? The review of his relationships led investigators back to September 2024. At that time, Paul Scott had been involved in a minor altercation in the area. According to the information gathered, Paul had intervened to stop an argument between other individuals. The incident did not result in serious consequences at the time, but it left behind underlying tensions in personal relationships. For the police, such details are never overlooked. In many cases, conflicts that seem to have faded away become the key to unlocking the entire story behind what happened. Investigators concluded, when there are no signs of forced entry or robbery, the victim's personal relationships always become the central focus of the investigation. From this point on, the direction of the case gradually became clear. Based on the information gathered about the victim and his circle of relationships, the investigation quickly moved into a crucial phase, identifying those directly involved within the time frame of the incident. Police began working with individuals who were present near the scene in the early hours of that morning, including people recorded as being in the Peridot Close area or who had contact with the victim during his final hours. This process relied not only on statements, but also on cross-checking times, locations, and other objective details. During these initial interviews, investigators noticed that some statements did not fully align. Small discrepancies in timing, in who was where, and what they were doing that night gradually became significant. For the police, such inconsistencies were a sign that it was necessary to go beyond routine voluntary interviews. After assessing and consolidating the initial information, police made an important procedural decision. 3 individuals were identified as suspects in connection with the case and were arrested for questioning. This information was quickly released to the public in a brief statement. 3 people have been arrested on suspicion of involvement in the murder in Blackburn. However, at this stage, police did not disclose any details about the specific roles of each suspect. The public only knew that arrests had been made, but who did what, and what truly happened that night, remained undisclosed. Only after this turning point did the investigation have sufficient grounds to delve deeper into what had occurred before 3:40 a.m. After the 3 suspects were arrested, their identities were confirmed by police. Joanne Maxwell, Liam Donlin, and Amy Clegg. Importantly, these 3 were not strangers to one another, but were directly related by family ties, and all had personal connections to the victim, Paul Scott. From this point onward, the investigation no longer focused solely on what happened, but shifted to a more fundamental question. Why did it happen? Through the extraction of phone data, analysis of movement histories, and cross-checking of the suspect's statements, police established that the cause of the incident stemmed from a long-standing personal conflict. This conflict was linked to an event in September 2024, when Paul Scott had intervened in an argument involving Joanne Maxwell. Although the incident did not lead to legal consequences at the time, investigators assessed that it left behind unresolved resentment. In the statements and data collected, this old conflict was referenced repeatedly, particularly on the evening of 21st June 2025. Police determined that on that night, the suspects met at a bar in Blackburn. There, past tensions were reignited, this time with heightened emotions. After leaving the bar, all 3 took a taxi and traveled to another address. According to the investigation's findings, kitchen utensils were taken from this location before the group continued on their way. Within the communications data, police also noted a statement of particular significance. "This has to be dealt with tonight." For investigators, this statement indicated that the conflict had moved from words to deliberate action. Decisions made within a short period of time led the parties to Peridot Close in the early hours of that morning. However, at this stage, police had not announced who had directly carried out the actions that led to Paul Scott's death. What had been established were the identities of the suspects, the relationships between them, and the underlying cause that led to the incident. The remainder of the story would only truly be determined when the events at Peridot Close were weighed in the court of law. After leaving the final location of the night, Joanne Maxwell, Liam Donlin, and Amy Clegg traveled to Peridot Close, where Paul Scott lived. This marked the endpoint of a chain of decisions made within a short period of time, and also the place where all subsequent evidence would be examined. According to what was established in the investigation files, Amy Clegg was the person who called Paul Scott out to the front of his house. This caused the victim to leave the interior of his home and confront the group standing outside. The interaction unfolded quickly, in a context where tension had already been present. In that moment, according to the court's findings, Liam Donlin was the person who carried out the violent act that led to Paul Scott's death. The investigation determined that the incident occurred over a very short period of time, without prolongation, but with irreversible consequences. Paul Scott collapsed directly in front of the entrance to his own home. One detail of particular significance in the case file was that Amy Clegg used her phone to record the events as they unfolded. For the prosecuting authorities, this action indicated that those present were still sufficiently aware to perceive and respond, rather than being completely out of control. After that moment, an emergency call was made at approximately 3:40 a.m. This time later became a crucial reference point, as upon reanalysis, investigators noted that the information provided was not entirely consistent, and the identities of those present were not clearly disclosed from the outset. The focus of the investigation therefore shifted fully to what happened after the incident. In subsequent interviews, no one in the group admitted direct responsibility. Each person's account differed in terms of sequence and role. However, alongside the statements, phone data and movement information revealed a different picture. When timelines and locations were placed side by side, they did not fully align with what had been presented verbally. It was precisely the gap between the statements and the objective data that became a critical foundation for the next stage of the case. From this point on, the question was no longer what had happened at Peridot Close, but who should be held responsible, and to what extent. After the investigation concluded, the entire case file was transferred to the Crown Prosecution Service. With the evidence verified, the case was brought to trial at Preston Crown Court, where every final detail was subjected to legal scrutiny. At the trial, the identities of the defendants were formally announced: Joanne Maxwell, Liam Donlin, and Amy Clegg. The relationship between them quickly drew attention: a mother and her two biological children. From this point, the case was no longer viewed as the act of a single individual, but as a family-related incident involving multiple people within the same group. During the proceedings, the role of each defendant was clarified. The prosecution argued that this was not a spontaneous reaction or a situation beyond control. The evidence showed that each person took specific actions that contributed to the final outcome, even though their levels of involvement were not the same. Crucially, the events at Peridot Close did not occur in isolation, but were supported and reinforced by those present. The climax of the trial came when the jury completed its deliberations. Based on the totality of the evidence and legal arguments, they reached a unanimous conclusion. This was a coordinated act. On January 30th, 2026, the verdict was delivered. All three defendants were found guilty of murder. The court affirmed that within the framework of the law, criminal responsibility does not rest solely with the person who directly carried out the act, but also includes those who were fully aware of what was happening, participated in the process, and failed to prevent the outcome. The case concluded with a clear and uncompromising legal principle. Under the law, silence and assistance can also constitute the crime of murder. When the case came to an end, it was not only three people who were deprived of their freedom, but many other lives were also forced onto a path from which there was no return. Paul Scott's family lost a loved one right on the threshold of his home, a place that should have been the safest of all. As for the defendant's family, bonds of blood were not enough to shield them from the consequences of a series of wrong decisions. The most frightening aspect of this case does not lie in the moment the act occurred, but in the chain of deeply human choices that came before it. Holding on to resentment instead of letting go, remaining silent instead of intervening, and standing together in a wrong decision instead of stopping at the right moment. The law has named responsibility, but the lesson it leaves behind is for all of us. An unresolved conflict can quietly grow, until the day it destroys multiple lives at once.